DarkOfAllTrades presents responses to your question. Before we begin, as a disclaimer, I am not an evolutionary biologist, a regular biologist, or a physicist. I do not have a degree in any field of science. I'm an educator. My degrees are in education. As such, I'm giving you the best information I have available. Check my sources. For more in-depth information on biology and physics, contact the corresponding department at your state university or check out the relevant scientific sources. I've been getting a number of responses on my channel and in my email. I've seen these types of questions so often that I think it's time for me to address two of these questions that I've been getting. This is from my video on the false dichotomy fallacy. In this series, I'm doing my absolute best to not bring any of my personal opinions or biases to the video, as I want to provide the best information possible so that you, the viewer, can learn and apply what you learn to your conversations. This video gets a bit more technical toward the end as we depart from philosophy and get into the realm of biology and physics, but these are questions I see regularly. In my video, I give several examples of false dichotomies. The very first one is, either evolution is true or creationism is true. So let's take a look at the questions. What alternative do you have to the evolution-creation debate? Because there is no way for both to be true. The overarching question here is pretty common. There are several potential ways to answer this question. The easy way is just provide a third example. I could say some variation on the argument that life is eternal, or I could say that we live in an alien biodome experiment. I could bring up the panspermia hypothesis. That is, that life originated somewhere else in space and was brought here by something like an asteroid that crashed into Earth. Note, I understand that the response for the aliens hypothesis is that the answer just pushes the question into space, but this can be a legitimate point, as the alien forms may not be life as we would call it, but something else entirely. I have also heard that as the aliens are what we call God, and I don't find that a justifiable position, especially in monotheistic sects. In a more formal setting, I would point out that the two options are not direct logical negations and could, in fact, both be accurate, which negates the second part of the question. Evolution is simply the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. It says absolutely nothing about how life started. There are plenty of theistic evolutionists in my circle of friends, let alone the world. Francis Collins, the man who led the Human Genome Project, describes theistic evolution as the position that, quote, evolution is real, but that it was set in motion by God, end quote. If it is true that a God created the building blocks of life, and then natural processes took over from there, causing the change in allele frequencies, then both creationism, or at least some form of creationism, and evolution would be true simultaneously. If I were feeling particularly combative, I would point out the potential shifting of the burden of proof fallacy here. I could point out that it is not necessarily up to me to show that there are more options, but to express that the person making the claim has not justified the claim that there are only two options. Again, these are not direct logical negations, so this needs to be justified. Finally, if I didn't feel like doing any of that, I would just say, I don't know if there are any other options. I do not need to have a position on a claim to call someone else's position into question. It is not incumbent on me to provide a third option, or else it isn't a false dichotomy. Addressing the actual science. We know that it is possible for the building blocks of life to come about by natural processes. For all of its flaws, the Miller-Urey experiment showed that it is possible even if their conditions were not exactly to the early Earth. For more information, check out the link for the article Production of Amino Acids Under Possible Primitive Earth Conditions, or Organic Compound Synthesis on the Primitive Earth in the description. There are hundreds of articles on the experiment, free to the public. If this is something you're interested in, I recommend checking it out. The second question I'm going to address is life guaranteed by the laws of physics? If so, why don't we see it happen all the time? I am not convinced that life is guaranteed by the laws of physics. I'm not even convinced that the laws of physics would actually affect whether life itself existed or not. This sounds a lot like the question, why is there something rather than nothing? While I'm not aware of a concrete answer, it could be that something is the default state. To address the question a bit more directly, The laws of physics are descriptive and not prescriptive. They are observations on how the universe works. They don't dictate anything. So by that reasoning, the laws of physics don't guarantee life at all. As to whether life was inevitable due to the laws of physics, it could be the case, especially under a model such as determinism or compatibilism. The question typically leads to some form of the fine-tuning argument. That is, the universe is fine-tuned for life, so there must be something behind that tuning. The response to that is, life exists in the form that could survive given the parameters of the conditions of the universe. If those parameters were different, then another form of life may have arisen that could under those circumstances. We don't know. Consider Douglas Adams' Puddle Analogy for a more simplistic explanation, link in the description. As for the second part of the question, it depends on what you mean. When asked this question, Dan O'Day, a science educator, said, "Are you referring to new life?" A lot depends on how you define, quote, new life. New species happen on a regular basis. Evolution has not stopped, although it usually happens more slowly than we can observe. If you mean, quote, new types of life, end quote, where do you draw the line? Phylum? Kingdom? New biochemical basis, e.g. silicon? If you mean new types of life, as being a new kingdom besides archaea, bacteria, plants, and so on, that's an interesting question. I might argue that new, simple life forms get eaten before they develop into something we can observe. The Earth is heavily populated with organic life already, much of it using some form of chemical uptake as or to supplement existing life processes. Therefore, it is very likely a new life form is getting eaten before it has the chance to develop. Link to the full response in the description. Life does happen all of the time. We discover new species regularly. In November of 2020, it was reported in Nature Biotechnology that, quote, an international team of researchers has found 12,556 new species of bacteria and archaea that have never been grown in a lab using an incredibly cool technique called metagenomics, end quote. Source for this is in the description. If these were questions you had, I hope this answered them. Remember that I'm an educator, and even though I communicate these concepts, you should make sure to do your own due diligence and check not only my sources, but other sources so you can see what the consensus is. Special thanks to Potato Head Pokemario for allowing me to use their wording for these questions. Any more questions?